My sister Valerie had been in our guest room for exactly 3 weeks when my husband Calvin stopped closing our bedroom door at night, as if he were waiting for a draft to clear the room. It was a small house, a brick ranch style on the outskirts of Grand Rapids, the kind of place where you could hear the refrigerator compressor kick on from the master bedroom. For 28 years, Calvin and I had lived in the predictable quiet of that house. We had raised our son, Mitchell, who now lived in Denver and only called when his car insurance was due or when he needed me to find his old birth certificate in the filing cabinet. After Mitchell left, the house had settled into a comfortable, dusty stillness. Then Valerie's marriage collapsed. Valerie was 8 years younger than me, born when our mother was too tired to do much more than let her run wild. She had always been the sister who needed saving. I was the sister who did the saving. When she called me from a motel parking lot in Toledo, crying because her husband had locked her out of their joint account, I didn't hesitate. I told Calvin we had to bring her here. Of course, Calvin had said at the time, not looking up from his tablet. He was a quiet man, a claims adjuster for a mid-sized insurance firm who spent his life measuring the exact cost of other people's disasters. It's only right, Cheryl. She's family. But family, I have learned, is like water. In small amounts, it sustains you. In large amounts, it softens the foundation until the walls begin to lean. The guest room was at the end of the hall, past the bathroom. It had been my sewing room, a place where I kept my mother's old Singer machine and stacks of floral cotton fabric I always promised myself I would turn into quilts. To make room for Valerie, I packed the fabric into cardboard boxes and stacked them in the damp basement. I left the sewing machine in the corner, covered with a white sheet, like a small draped monument. Valerie arrived with 3 suitcases and a cardboard box of half-empty perfume bottles that made the hallway smell of cheap jasmine and burnt sugar. She was 46, but she still wore her hair long and dyed a stark, glossy black that made her pale skin look paper-thin. "I'll only be a month," she whispered, clinging to me on the front porch while the autumn wind rattled the dry oak leaves against the gutters. "Just until I get my feet under me, Cheryl." "Take your time," I told her, patting her back. I felt her ribs beneath her thin sweater. They felt small and fragile, like the bones of a bird that had flown into a window. For the first week, Valerie stayed in her room. She only came out after Calvin left for work at 7:30. I would find her sitting at the kitchen island in her satin robe, her eyes red-skinned and hollow, staring at a mug of black coffee. I made her dry toast. I listened to her talk about the cruelty of her husband, the loneliness of her 30s, the way she felt like a book that had been left out in the rain until the pages stuck together. I absorbed it all. I had spent my entire life absorbing the discomfort of others. When Mitchell was a teenager and went through his silent, angry phase, I was the one who smoothed over the tension at dinner, translating his grunts into polite conversation for Calvin. When Calvin's father was dying in a nursing home 3 miles away, I was the one who visited every day, changing the water in his plastic pitcher while Calvin sat in the car, unable to bear the smell of rubbing alcohol and old age. A woman can spend 30 years building a home only to realize she was never allowed to rest inside it. She is too busy maintaining the gravity that keeps everyone else from floating away. The shift began in the 2nd week. It was a Thursday evening. I was standing at the stove, browning pork chops in the cast-iron skillet. The kitchen was hot, the windows clouded with grease and steam. Valerie had come down early, dressed not in her robe, but in a soft, gray cashmere sweater I had given her for her birthday 3 years ago. A sweater she had never worn when she lived in Toledo. Calvin came through the back door, carrying his briefcase. He looked tired, his shoulders curved under his coat, his eyes dull from staring at spreadsheets of wind damage and roof estimates. "Smells good," he murmured, kissing my cheek. His lips were dry, smelling faintly of the peppermint lozenges he kept in his glove compartment. "Valerie helped me with the green beans," I said, though her help had consisted of snapping 3 pods and then sitting on the stool to watch me do the rest. Calvin looked past me to the kitchen island where Valerie was sitting. She didn't look up immediately. She was looking down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee mug. "Hello, Calvin," she said, her voice quiet, almost dusty. "I hope I'm not in the way." "You're not in the way, Val," Calvin said. His voice was different. It wasn't the flat, exhausted tone he used when he spoke to me about the lawnmower or the water bill. It had a strange, careful softness to it, the kind of voice a man uses when he's trying not to startle a dog. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," she whispered. She looked up then, her eyes dark and wide, catching the light from the overhead fluorescent tube. "Cheryl made me some tea earlier. She's been so good to me." "She's a saint," Calvin said. He didn't say it like a compliment. He said it the way people talk about the weather, as an established, unchangeable fact that required no active appreciation. He set his briefcase on the floor and did something he hadn't done in years. He went to the sink, washed his hands, and began to set the table without me asking him to. During dinner, the space between us seemed to shrink, though we were sitting at the same oak table we had used for 2 decades. Valerie sat opposite Calvin. I sat at the head, closest to the stove, where I could easily reach the extra napkins and the salt shaker. "They're cutting back at the agency," Calvin said, cutting his meat with small, precise movements. "They want us doing virtual inspections now, drone footage. They don't want us going out to the properties anymore." "That's awful," Valerie said. She set her fork down, her attention entirely on him. "But you've always been so thorough, Calvin. I remember when you did the appraisal on our first house. You spent 3 hours in the crawl space just to make sure there wasn't dry rot. You care about the details." Calvin paused, his knife hovering over his plate. He looked at Valerie, his eyes widening slightly. I had forgotten that Valerie remembered that. It was 15 years ago. I had also forgotten that Calvin liked being called thorough. In our house, thorough usually meant he took 3 weeks to clean the garage while the lawn grew tall enough to hide a small child. "Well," Calvin said, a faint color rising in his neck, "people deserve to get what they pay for. If you don't look closely, you miss the structural stuff." "Exactly," Valerie said, nodding. Her long, dark hair slid over her shoulder, touching the edge of her plate. She didn't seem to notice. "Most people only look at the paint. They don't care about what's holding it up." I reached for the salt. Neither of them looked at me. I salted my pork chop, the white grains falling into the grease, invisible against the brown meat. "The wind is coming from the north tonight," I said, trying to anchor myself back into the room. "We should close the storm windows in the basement." "I'll get to it," Calvin said, his tone instantly flattening as he turned back to his plate. "Later." That night, after Valerie had gone to her room and the house was dark, Calvin lay on his side of our queen-sized bed, his back to me. He was breathing heavily, the slow, rhythmic sign of a man on the edge of sleep. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling. The street lamp outside threw the shadow of the maple tree across our wallpaper, making it look as though the room were covered in dark, reaching fingers. From down the hall, through our open door, I heard the quiet click of Valerie's door opening. Then, the soft, barefooted scuff of her walking to the bathroom. A moment later, the pipes rumbled as the faucet turned on. Calvin shifted beside me. He didn't wake up, but he pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, leaving my side of the bed cold. I reached out and touched his shoulder, the rough flannel of his pajamas under my palm. He didn't move. He felt heavy, like a stone that had settled into the mud at the bottom of a river, completely undisturbed by the water rushing over it. The bathroom door clicked shut again. I lay there in the cold, listening to the silence that followed, wondering how many years a woman could spend keeping the peace before she realized she was the only one fighting for it. The next morning, the bathroom mirror was still clouded with steam when I went in to brush my teeth. The scent of Valerie's jasmine perfume hung heavy in the small, tiled space, clinging to the damp towels like a physical presence. On the edge of the sink, beside Calvin's blue plastic cup, sat a small tub of pink facial cream, its lid left off. A single dark hair, long and glossy, was trapped in the white paste. I stood there for a long moment, my toothbrush in my hand. I didn't throw the cream away, and I didn't put the lid back on. I simply took a tissue, wiped the sink dry where a puddle of soapy water had gathered near the faucet, and walked out. In the kitchen, Calvin was already sitting at the island, his laptop open beside his plate. Usually, he ate his oatmeal in silence, staring at the screen, barely acknowledging me when I refilled his coffee. But today, he had a small pad of yellow-lined paper next to his keyboard, and he was writing something down with his silver cross pen, the one Mitchell had given him for Father's Day 5 years ago, that usually sat in the velvet box in his dresser drawer. "Did you get the English muffins?" he asked, not looking up. "The English muffins?" I paused, my hand on the handle of the refrigerator. "The sourdough ones," he said, his pen scratching against the paper. "Valerie mentioned she can't eat the white bread. It gives her heartburn." "I have some whole wheat in the freezer," I said quietly. "She doesn't like whole wheat, Cheryl. It's too dry." He clicked his pen. "Just put it on the list for when you go to Meijer today. And she likes that hazelnut creamer, the one in the purple bottle." I looked at the back of his neck. His hair was thinning there, the gray strands showing clearly against his pale skin under the kitchen light. For 10 years, I had bought the same brand of low-fat milk, the same sugar-free marmalade, the same plain oats. He had never once asked me to change our list. He had never once noticed what was in the pantry unless it ran out. "I'll add it," I said. "Thanks." He finally looked up, but his eyes didn't rest on me. They drifted toward the hallway. "Is she still asleep?" "I haven't heard her," I said. He nodded, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm against his coffee mug. "She had a hard night. I heard her crying around 2. I almost went down to check on her, but I figured she needed space." I felt a cold, dull needle prick somewhere deep in my chest. "You heard her?" "Yeah, through the wall." He shrugged, turning back to his laptop. "Our bedroom is right above her ceiling, you know. Sound travels." I didn't tell him that for 28 years he had slept through Mitchell's night terrors, through the car alarms on the street, through the thunderstorms that rattled our glass. I didn't tell him that I was the one who woke up to every sound in this house, while he lay beside me like a felled log. Instead, I took my purse from the hook by the door and left for the grocery store. At the supermarket, the autumn morning light was gray and thin, casting long, pale shadows across the wet asphalt of the parking lot. I walked the aisles with my cart, my movements automatic. My sister had been in our house for less than a month, and already the landscape of my daily life was shifting. I found myself standing in front of the dairy case, looking at the purple bottles of hazelnut creamer. The label was bright and loud, promising sweet indulgence. I held it in my hand, feeling the cold plastic, and thought about how my mother used to tell me that Valerie was delicate. "She's not like you, Cheryl," my mother would say, her fingers busy with some mending she had brought over to my house. "You're strong. You have a quiet back. You can carry things. Valerie needs a little extra shelter." I had believed her. I had spent 30 years being the shelter. But as I stood in the middle of aisle 4, holding a bottle of creamer for a woman who had never once asked me how my knees felt when the rain came in, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit to myself. Some people confuse unconditional love with permanent access. They think because you don't scream, you don't feel the weight of what they are piling onto your shoulders. When I returned home, the driveway was empty. Calvin's sedan was gone, as it should be at 11 in the morning. But when I unlocked the back door, carrying 3 heavy canvas bags of groceries, I heard voices coming from the living room. I paused in the mudroom, my coat half off, my boots still on my feet. "It's just that he made me feel so small," Valerie was saying. Her voice was different than it had been when she cried on the phone from Toledo. It was softer now, lighter, like she was telling a sad story about someone else. Like I was just a piece of furniture he bought to fill a corner. "Some men don't know what they have," Calvin replied. I stood perfectly still. The mudroom smelled of wet wool and the bleach I used to clean the linoleum. "I tried so hard, Calvin," she whispered. "I kept the house perfect. I wore the things he liked. But it was like I was invisible." "You're not invisible," Calvin said. His voice was closer than I expected. I stepped quietly to the threshold of the kitchen and looked through the archway into the living room. They were sitting on the green velvet sofa, the one I had saved for 2 years to buy, the one Calvin had complained was too formal for daily use. Valerie was tucked into the corner of the cushions, her knees pulled up to her chest, her gray cashmere sweater pulled down over her hands. Calvin was sitting on the opposite end, but he was leaned toward her, his arm resting on the back of the sofa. Between them, spread out on the coffee table, were 3 of our old photo albums. These weren't the albums from the guest room. These were the ones I kept in the cedar chest at the foot of our bed, the ones containing our wedding photos, the pictures of Mitchell's first steps, the trip we took to the Smoky Mountains when we were still young enough to sleep in a tent without our backs aching. "Look at this one," Calvin murmured, pointing to a small, glossy square. "You were what, 12 here?" 14, Valerie said, a small, wet laugh escaping her. "I hated that dress. Cheryl made me wear it for Easter. She said I looked like a dandelion." "You didn't look like a dandelion," Calvin said. He was smiling. It was the slow, lazy smile he only used when he was relaxed, the one I hadn't seen since our last vacation 4 years ago. "You looked bright." I stepped into the room, the plastic grocery bags rustling in my hands. The sound was like a small explosion in the quiet house. Calvin's hand dropped from the back of the sofa. He didn't jump, but his shoulders instantly went rigid, the casual posture disappearing as if a cold wind had blown through the room. "Cheryl," he said, clearing his throat, "you're back early." "The lines were short," I said. I set the bags down on the dining table. My hands were stiff from the cold handles. "You're home early, too. I thought you had 3 inspections in Kentwood today." "2 of them rescheduled," he said, standing up quickly. He smoothed the front of his trousers, not looking at Valerie. "The rain delayed the roofers. I came back to grab some files I left in the den." "I see," I said. Valerie didn't stand up. She stayed on the sofa, her dark eyes looking up at me through her bangs. She looked small, almost childlike, surrounded by the heavy albums of my life. "I'm sorry, Cheryl," she said, her voice dropping to that soft, wounded register. "I was looking for some old photos of Mom, and Calvin helped me find them. I hope you don't mind." "Of course not," I said. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up the wedding album. The cover was white faux leather, beginning to yellow at the corners. I closed it, the heavy thud of the pages sealing the memories away. But these are private, Valerie. The photos of Mom are in the basement boxes. I told you that. Right, she said, her lower lip twitching slightly. I forgot. My head has been so foggy lately. Calvin looked at me, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. She was just looking, Cheryl. No need to make a federal case out of it. I'm not, I said, my voice flat, polite, and completely empty. I just don't want the pages to get torn. They're old. I carried the albums back to our bedroom, my boots clicking heavy against the hardwood floor. When I came back down, Calvin's briefcase was gone, and the back door was just clicking shut. From the hallway, I heard Valerie's door close, softly, with that quiet, careful click that was becoming the most familiar sound in my house. The basement of our house always smelled of damp earth and the old coal furnace we had replaced in the 90s. It was where I did the laundry, standing before the white enameled washer and dryer under a single bare bulb that hung from a joist. On Saturday morning, I was sorting the clothes into piles, white, dark, and the delicate knits that had to be washed on gentle. I picked up Calvin's heavy blue flannel shirt, the one he wore on weekends when he raked the yard or cleared the gutters. As I gathered the sleeves to check the pockets for receipts or loose change, a scent rose from the collar. It wasn't his usual smell of cedar shaving soap and sweat. It was the sharp, synthetic sweetness of jasmine. It wasn't a spill, it was a transfer, the kind of lingering fragrance that stays behind when two people sit close enough for their shoulders to touch, or when one person leans against another to look at a photograph. I held the sleeve for a long moment, the rough fabric cool against my palm. I didn't smell it again. I didn't shake my head or cry. I simply dropped the shirt into the washing machine, poured in the unscented detergent I had used for 20 years, and turned the dial to heavy duty. A man who has forgotten how to be gentle with his wife will suddenly find a reservoir of tenderness for a woman who makes him feel like a savior. It is not love, I realized as the machine began to fill with water. It is the desire to be worshipped by someone who doesn't yet know his ordinary cruelties. By late Sunday afternoon, the sky over Grand Rapids had turned the color of a wet slate shingle. The wind came howling down from Lake Michigan, carrying the first real freeze of November. It rattled the loose pane in the kitchen window and whipped the dead ivy against the side of the garage. We were in the living room. The television was on, a football game playing with the volume low. The green field on the screen the only bright thing in the darkening room. Calvin was in his recliner, his ankles crossed, his eyes closed. Valerie was on the floor near the heating vent, her knees tucked under her, a cup of the hazelnut coffee I had bought her resting on the carpet. The grid is going to go, Calvin muttered, opening one eye to look at the window as the glass groaned against a sudden gust. The branch on the neighbor's silver maple is hanging right over the line. I hate the wind, Valerie whispered. She pulled her sweater tighter around herself, her shoulders hunched. In Toledo, when the wind got like this, the old house would creak so loud I couldn't sleep. Gary used to leave me alone in the dark when he went to the bar. He knew I was terrified of it. Calvin sat up, his recliner clicking as his feet hit the floor. He looked down at her, his face softening in the dim gray light. Well, you aren't in Toledo now, Val. And this house isn't going anywhere. I cleared the dead wood off our roof 3 years ago. I know, she said, looking up at him with a small, trembling smile. You keep everything so safe, Calvin. Just then, the television screen shrank to a single white dot and vanished. The lamp in the corner flickered twice and died, plunging the room into a deep, heavy twilight. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen stopped, leaving only the sound of the wind screaming through the dry branches outside. Valerie gasped, a small, sharp sound of genuine fright. "It's okay," Calvin said immediately. He didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for me to suggest finding the flashlight. He stood up, his cell phone already in his hand, the blue-white beam of its flashlight slicing through the dark. I stayed on the sofa. In the dark, I was just a shape against the fabric, as invisible as the cushions. "Cheryl," Calvin said, his voice loud in the quiet house, "where are the emergency candles?" "In the pantry," I said, "on the top shelf, behind the canned peaches." I didn't get up to get them. I wanted to see what they would do if I didn't move. Calvin walked past me, the light from his phone sweeping across my lap, then disappearing into the kitchen. I heard him rummaging through the cupboards, the glass jars clinking together. "I can't find them," he called out, his voice tinged with a familiar irritation. "You have too much junk in here, Cheryl." "They're exactly where I said they were, Calvin," I replied, my voice calm, level, and low. "In the blue tin." A moment later, I heard Valerie get up from the floor. Her slippers made a soft, shuffling sound on the wood as she followed his light into the kitchen. "Let me help," she said. "My eyes are better in the dark." I sat in the living room, surrounded by the shadows of my own furniture. Through the archway, I could see the glow of Calvin's phone bouncing off the white kitchen cabinets. I heard them speaking in low, hurried tones, not the voices of a brother-in-law and a sister, but the hushed, intimate murmurs of two people who believed they were alone in a shelter. "Here," Valerie said. "I found them." "Good girl," Calvin murmured. The phrase was small, but it struck me like a cold hand. He used to call me that. 30 years ago, when we were first married and I managed to fix a leak in the kitchen sink before he got home from work, he would pat my shoulder and say, "Good girl, Cheryl." I had thought it was sweet then. Now, hearing it directed at my sister in the dark, it sounded like a leash. A match scratched. A small yellow circle of light flared in the kitchen, illuminating Valerie's face from below. She looked beautiful in the candlelight, her sharp cheekbones softened, her dark eyes reflecting the tiny flame. Calvin was standing close to her, too close. His shoulder was brushed against hers, and his hand was resting on the counter right next to her hip. When they came back into the living room, Calvin was carrying the brass candlestick, and Valerie was walking beside him, her hand lightly touching his forearm as if to steady herself. "The temperature is dropping," Calvin said, setting the candle on the coffee table. He didn't look at me. "We should close the doors to the spare rooms to keep the heat in here." "I'll close mine," Valerie said, her voice small. "But it's really cold in there, Calvin. The vent doesn't work well." "I know," Calvin said. He looked at her, his eyes lingering on her face in the yellow candlelight. "The ductwork to the guest room is poorly insulated. I've been meaning to fix it." "It's fine," she said, though she shivered slightly, her shoulders shaking. "I'll just use extra blankets." "No," Calvin said. He turned to me then, his expression guarded, his jaw set in that stubborn line I knew too well. "Cheryl, she can't sleep in there if it's freezing. She's already got a cough." "The thermostat is set to 68, I said quietly. "She has 3 wool blankets in her closet." "It's not enough," Calvin said, his voice rising, a hard edge creeping into his tone. "The draft in that corner room is terrible. I'm going to set up the space heater in her room, but I don't trust the wiring in there. It's an old outlet." He paused, looking down at the candle on the table. "I think I should sleep on the cot in the hallway," he said, "just to make sure the heater doesn't trip the breaker during the night. If the power comes back on and the heater surges, it could start a fire." He had an explanation for everything. He was a claims adjuster. He spent his life calculating risks and creating narratives to justify them. "The cot is in the attic," I said. "It's dusty." "I'll clean it off," Calvin said. He didn't look at me. He looked at Valerie, who was staring at the floor, her face perfectly blank, her fingers twisting the hem of her cashmere sweater. "If you think that's best," I said. I stood up, took one of the small candles from the table, and walked down the dark hallway toward our bedroom. I didn't look back to see if they were watching me. I closed our bedroom door behind me, locked it with the small brass key that had remained in the keyhole since we moved in, and lay down on the cold bed in my clothes. The power came back on at 4:15 in the morning. I knew the exact time because the digital display on the microwave in the kitchen began to blink a bright, aggressive blue, casting a rhythmic glow down the hallway. With the electricity restored, the white noise of the house returned, the hum of the refrigerator, the low whistle of the furnace, and the quiet, steady vibration of the space heater in the guest room. I unlocked my bedroom door at 5:30. The air in the hallway was cold, smelling of ozone and wood smoke from the neighbor's chimney. I stepped out, my bare feet silent on the floorboards. The cot was there, set up against the drywall opposite the linen closet, but the sleeping bag on top of it was zipped up, completely flat, and cold to the touch. The pillow I had given him sat on the floor beside the cot, untouched. I walked down the hall to the kitchen. I didn't turn on the lights. I preferred the gray, pre-dawn shadows. They felt more honest than the bright glare of the overhead bulbs. I filled the metal kettle with water and set it on the stove, lighting the gas burner with a quiet click-click hiss. "Cheryl." I didn't flinch. I turned slowly. Calvin was standing at the entrance of the hallway. He was wearing his gray t-shirt and his flannel pajama pants. His hair was slept in, sticking up on one side, and his eyes were bloodshot. He was holding an empty ceramic mug, the one Valerie had been using the night before. "The kettle hasn't whistled yet," I said. He ran a hand over his face, his knuckles scraping against his graying stubble. He looked at the cot in the hallway, then back at me. His jaw tightened, his defensive armor locking into place before he even spoke. "The space heater was sparking," he said. His voice was too loud for the quiet kitchen, filled with a preemptive irritation. Around midnight, the outlet in her room started making this low, buzzing sound. I didn't want to risk a short circuit while she was sleeping, so I stayed in the armchair in her room to keep an eye on it. I must have drifted off. "I see," I said. "I didn't sleep in the bed, Cheryl," he said, his tone sharpening, his eyes narrowing as if he were daring me to call him a liar. "I sat in the chair, in case of a fire." "You don't have to explain yourself, Calvin," I said, my voice as level as a frozen lake. "You're a claims adjuster. You manage risk." He stared at me, his chest rising and falling. My lack of anger seemed to frustrate him more than a screaming match would have. When a person is harboring a quiet guilt, their first instinct is to make you apologize for noticing it. They want the relief of your anger so they can play the victim. But I wouldn't give him that relief. "You locked your door last night," he said, stepping closer to the island. "That was dramatic, don't you think? In a storm? What if I had needed to get in?" "Why would you need to get in?" I asked, looking him directly in the eyes. "You were keeping Valerie safe from the outlet. I was perfectly safe in our room." His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked down at the empty mug in his hand. "You're being cold, Cheryl. You've been cold ever since she got here. She's your sister. She has nowhere else to go." "The water is hot," I said, turning my back to him to turn off the burner. I poured myself a cup of black tea. I didn't offer him any, and I didn't make his oatmeal. I sat at the kitchen island, holding my mug in both hands, letting the steam warm my face. He stood there for another minute, waiting for me to say something else, to start the familiar dance of domestic smoothing over that we had performed for nearly 30 years. But I remained silent. Eventually, He let out a short, angry breath, turned on his heel, and walked back down the hallway, closing Valerie's door behind him. After breakfast, which Calvin and Valerie ate in their respective rooms, leaving their empty bowls in their sinks for me to find, I went down to the basement. I needed to be away from the air of the first floor, which felt thick and suffocating, like a room where the windows hadn't been opened in years. I went to the corner where my sewing machine sat under its white sheet. I pulled the sheet off. The black iron of my mother's Singer was cold, the needle threaded with a faded spool of green cotton. Beside the desk were the 3 cardboard boxes of my quilting fabric, the fabric I had spent decades collecting, piece by piece, intending to make something beautiful when I finally had the time. I knelt on the cold concrete floor and pulled the lid off the first box. I wanted to feel the weight of the cotton, the heavy texture of the flannel, the familiar patterns that reminded me of who I was before I became the woman who cleaned up after everyone else. But as I lifted a stack of blue calico squares, my fingers brushed against something thick and smooth. It wasn't fabric. Tucked between a fold of heavy wool and an old quilting hoop was a large manila envelope. It was unsealed, the metal clasp bent open. On the front, written in Valerie's sharp, slanted handwriting, was a single word: personal. I held the envelope in my hands. The basement was completely silent, save for the rhythmic slosh of the washing machine running a cycle of Calvin's shirts. I pulled the documents out. They were legal papers from a law firm in Toledo. I skipped past the standard jargon, my eyes scanning the pages until they landed on the financial disclosure forms. According to the bank statements dated from 3 weeks ago, the very week Valerie had called me crying from the motel parking lot, she had a savings account with a balance of $48,000. There was also a copy of the divorce petition. It hadn't been filed by her husband Gary, it had been filed by Valerie. And the reason listed for the dissolution of the marriage wasn't Gary's cruelty or financial abuse. It was irreconcilable differences, followed by a custody and property agreement that left Valerie with their suburban townhome and a substantial cash settlement. She wasn't destitute. She hadn't been locked out of her accounts. She didn't need a temporary place to sleep because she had nowhere else to go. She had $48,000 in the bank, and she had chosen to move into my guest room, to sit on my green sofa, to eat the food I bought, and to let my husband watch her sleep in the dark. I sat on the cold concrete floor, the papers white against my dark jeans. Suddenly, the wooden stairs behind me creaked. "Cheryl?" I didn't look up immediately. I carefully folded the papers back into the envelope and slid it under the blue calico fabric. Then I stood up and turned to face the stairs. Valerie was standing on the 3rd step from the bottom. She was wearing her satin robe, her long black hair damp from the shower, smelling of that suffocating jasmine. Her eyes were wide, taking in the open boxes, the sewing machine, and the silence of the basement. "What are you doing down here?" she asked, her voice soft, but with a thin, sharp edge of panic underneath. "I was looking for my mother's green thread," I said. I held up a small wooden spool of cotton I had taken from the top basket. My hand was steady, though my heart was beating in a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "I thought it was in the box with the calico." Valerie stood on the stairs, her fingers gripping the wooden handrail. Her knuckles were white, the skin stretched tight over the bone. She looked at the sewing machine, then at the open box where the manila envelope lay hidden under the blue fabric. Her eyes darted back to my face, searching for any sign of change, any crack in my usual, quiet expression. "You startled me," she said, her voice dropping back into its familiar, breathless register. She took a step down, the hem of her satin robe dragging against the dusty wood. "I didn't think you used this room anymore. You always said the basement was too damp for your joints. It is, I said. I set the spool of thread on the sewing machine table. But some things are worth the damp. She stood at the bottom of the stairs now, her perfume fighting against the smell of the wet concrete. She looked at the boxes of fabric, her shoulder shifting beneath the satin. I should pack those up for you. Get them out of your way. I know I've taken up your space upstairs. Don't worry about it, I said, my voice soft, almost warm. They're fine where they are. I know exactly where everything is. We stood there for a long moment, the distance between us filled with the low, rhythmic hum of the washing machine. It was the same silence we had shared as children, when Valerie had broken our mother's crystal vase and stood over the pieces, waiting for me to take the blame so she wouldn't have to cry. I had taken it then. I had taken it because I was the older sister, and because I thought protecting her was my job. Calvin's coming home for lunch, Valerie said, her eyes drifting toward the ceiling. He said he had some paperwork to drop off. He's been coming home for lunch a lot lately, I murmured. He's just trying to be helpful, Cheryl. He knows how hard this has been on me. She looked at me, her lower lip trembling slightly, her eyes wide with a practiced, liquid sorrow. I don't know what I would have done without you two, truly. We do what we have to do, I said. I walked past her, my shoulder brushing against her satin sleeve. I went up the stairs, leaving her alone in the damp cellar, standing beside the boxes that held her secrets. At noon, the kitchen was bright with a cold white light. Calvin was sitting at the table, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He had his tablet open, but he wasn't looking at it. He was watching Valerie as she chopped celery for a salad. She was clumsy with the knife, her small, pale hands holding the stalk awkwardly. Every time the blade hit the plastic cutting board with a loud thwack, Calvin's shoulders would twitch, his eyes fixed on her fingers as if he were waiting to catch her if she slipped. Cheryl, Calvin said as I entered the kitchen. He cleared his throat, his hand going to his collar. Have a seat. We were just talking about something. I sat down at the head of the table. I didn't wash my hands, though they still felt dry from the basement dust. Valerie's car, Calvin began, his voice taking on that professional, analytical tone he used when he was explaining a policy exclusion to a policyholder. I looked at the alternator this morning before I left. It's shot, and the transmission is slipping. It's going to cost more to fix it than the vehicle is worth. It's an old car, I said. Exactly, Calvin said, nodding, and she can't be without a vehicle. She has interviews coming up. She needs to be able to get to Toledo for her court dates. It's a safety issue, Cheryl. I can take the bus, Valerie said from the counter, her voice small. She didn't turn around. I don't want to be a burden. You've both done so much already. You're not taking the bus, Val, Calvin said, his tone sharp with a sudden protective anger. The bus route in this city is a joke, and it's not safe for a woman alone at night. He turned back to me, his eyes hard, his mouth set in a stubborn line. I was thinking we could draw $5,000 from our joint savings, he said, just to get her a reliable, certified pre-owned sedan. Something with a warranty. We can treat it as a loan. She can pay us back once her divorce settlement is finalized. I looked at him. I looked at the gray hair at his temples, the small wrinkles around his eyes, the way his hand rested on the table, thick and heavy. For 28 years, we had kept our savings in a credit union down the street. It was the money we had set aside for Mitchell's college, the money we had saved by not taking vacations, by repairing our own roof, by buying generic brands. It was the physical manifestation of our shared sacrifices. And he wanted to hand it to my sister, who was currently hiding $48,000 in my basement. Our joint savings is for Mitchell, I said quietly. He's talking about going back for his master's in the spring. Mitchell is 26, Calvin said, his voice rising, a flush of red creeping up his neck. He's working. He can take out a student loan like everyone else. Your sister is in a crisis, Cheryl. She's family. Where is your sense of proportion? My proportion is exactly where it has always been, Calvin, I said. I can't believe you're being this selfish, Calvin said, his fingers digging into the edge of the table. You're sitting on a comfortable house, a stable life, and you're watching your own sister drown because you're greedy over a few $1,000s. I looked at the kitchen walls. They were painted a pale, buttery yellow, the color my mother had chosen 40 years ago when she lived here. This house wasn't ours, it was mine. My father had built it with his own hands in 1968. When he died, he hadn't left it to us. He had left it to me, in my name alone, because he knew Calvin's family had a history of bad investments, and he wanted to make sure his daughter always had a roof over her head. Calvin had paid for the taxes and the utilities over the years, but the deed, the dirt, and the foundation belonged to me. Calvin had forgotten that, or perhaps he had simply decided that after 28 years, what was mine had naturally become his to spend. I'll think about it, I said. We don't have time for you to think about it, Calvin snapped. The dealer in Wyoming has a Civic that's perfect for her. He's only holding it until tomorrow morning. Then he'll have to sell it to someone else, I said. I stood up from the table. I didn't look at Valerie, who had stopped chopping the celery and was standing perfectly still, her back to us, her shoulders slightly shaking as if she were crying. I'm going to go rake the leaves, I said. I walked out the back door into the cold, sharp air of the yard. The wind was still blowing from the north, carrying the smell of winter. I grabbed the orange plastic rake from the garage and began to work, pulling the dry, dead leaves into a neat, heavy pile against the fence. I worked until my arms ached and my breath came in short, white puffs. With every stroke of the rake, I felt the structure of my life, the invisible scaffolding I had spent decades building, begin to loosen. I had spent 30 years keeping the peace, but peace, I was beginning to see, is not the absence of conflict. It is simply the quiet before the storm. The Lake Michigan Credit Union was quiet at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning. The air inside smelled of carpet cleaner, wet boots, and the stale peppermint candy they kept in a brass bowl near the teller windows. I sat across from Beverly, a woman who had handled our mortgages, our car loans, and our savings accounts for 15 years. Her hair was a tight, permed cloud of silver, and she wore her reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. I just wanted to check the balance on the joint savings, Beverly, I said, my hands folded on my purse. I'm doing some end-of-the-year planning for Mitchell's tuition. Of course, Cheryl, Beverly said, her fingers clacking against her keyboard with a soft plastic rhythm. She smiled, but as her eyes scanned the blue screen, the smile faded into a small, professional line. She adjusted her glasses, leaning closer. Oh, she said, her voice dropping to a discreet murmur. I see Calvin was in here yesterday afternoon, just before we closed. My throat felt dry, but I didn't let my fingers tighten around my purse. Was he? Yes, he made a cash withdrawal, $4,800. She looked up, her eyes filled with a quiet, neighborly concern. He said it was for a family emergency, a vehicle purchase. I assumed you knew, since it was from the joint account. Yes, I said. My voice was a thin, steady thread. Of course, I just wanted to verify the remaining balance. There's $1,214 left in the savings, Beverly said, her fingers hovering over the print button. Would you like a copy of the receipt? No, thank you, I said. That won't be necessary. I stood up, smoothed the front of my wool coat, and walked out into the gray November light. For some people, forgiveness is easier to ask for than permission because they view your silence as a blank check. They mistake patience for stupidity and restraint for permission. Calvin had lived with me for nearly 3 decades, and in that time, he had come to believe that my quietness was a form of soft clay he could mold to suit his own convenience. When I pulled into our driveway, the silver Honda Civic was already there. It sat behind Calvin's sedan, its wet tires leaving dark tracks on the concrete. It was clean, the gray metallic paint gleaming under the low, heavy clouds. Valerie was sitting in the driver's seat, her hands on the steering wheel. Her face turned toward the passenger side where Calvin was leaning in through the open window, pointing at the dashboard. They were both smiling. It was a shared, bright moment of triumph, the kind of look parents have when they've managed to put together a complicated toy on Christmas Eve while the child is asleep. I parked my car, got out, and closed the door. The sound of the latch was loud in the cold air. Calvin looked up. The smile vanished from his face, replaced instantly by that hard, defensive posture he had worn since the storm. He stepped away from the passenger window, straightening his coat, his eyes locked on me as I walked up the driveway. "Cheryl," he said, his voice loud, carrying over the wind. "We had to move fast. The dealer had another offer on the table. I tried to call you, but your phone must have been off." My phone had been in my purse, turned on, the entire time. There were no missed calls. "It's a great little car," he continued, his words coming quick, a barrage of logic meant to overwhelm any protest before I could make it. "Great mileage. The tires are practically new. I drove it back from Wyoming myself. It's solid." Valerie got out of the car. She looked small in her oversized winter coat, her glossy black hair whipping across her face in the wind. She didn't look at me directly. She kept her eyes on the hood of the car, her fingers tracing the edge of the headlight. "I'm so sorry, Cheryl," she whispered. "I know you wanted to wait, but Calvin said it was too dangerous for me to be without a way to get around. I'll pay you back, every cent of it." "The money is gone," I said. I didn't say it with anger. I said it the way one might observe that the leaves had fallen from the maple tree. It was a fact. It was a piece of reality we now had to live in. "We'll manage, Cheryl," Calvin said, his tone turning dismissive, his irritation returning now that the hurdle of telling me was over. "It's a loan. We're helping her get on her feet. That's what family does." "Yes," I said, "that's what family does." I walked past them, my boots crunching on the wet leaves. I went into the house, unlocked the back door, and set my purse on the kitchen counter. Through the window, I watched them. Calvin was helping her adjust the driver's seat, his hand resting on the headrest as he leaned over her. He looked younger. He looked like a man who had a purpose again, a man who was needed by someone who didn't know the dry, silent routine of his daily life. I waited until I heard the silver Civic start up, the quiet engine humming as they drove out of the driveway for a test run. Once the house was completely silent, I went down to the basement. I pulled the white sheet off the sewing machine, reached into the cardboard box of calico, and pulled out the manila envelope. I sat on the stool, my knees cold under my jeans, and opened the legal documents. I looked at the Toledo law firm's letterhead. At the bottom of the financial disclosure page, there was a list of contacts. Gary's phone number was written there, beneath his attorney's address. I took my cell phone from my coat pocket. My fingers were cold, but they didn't shake. I dialed the 10 digits and pressed call. The phone rang 4 times. I was about to hang up when a man's voice answered, rough, tired, and thick with the sound of a television playing in the background. "Yeah?" "Gary?" I said. "This is Cheryl, Valerie's sister." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. The sound of the television seemed to fade, as if he had muted it. "Cheryl," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of any surprise. "I was wondering when you'd call. Did she tell you she was broke, or did she tell you she was sleeping in your guest room?" She's in the guest room, I said. Gary let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. Of course, she is. She always liked your house. She used to talk about how quiet it was up there, how Calvin always listened to her. My hand tightened around the phone. What do you mean, Gary? She didn't leave me because of our differences, Cheryl, Gary said, his voice dropping to a low, bitter murmur. And she didn't leave because she was broke. She's been planning this since your mother's funeral 2 years ago. She and Calvin, they've been writing to each other. He's got a post office box in Granville. She showed me the letters during the mediation. She used them to get me to agree to the cash settlement so I wouldn't drag his name into the court record. He paused, the silence down the line stretching out like a dark road. She's got $48,000 in a savings account, Cheryl. And she's had it there since September. She didn't come to you for help. She came to take the rest of what you have. Calvin was the one who told her to file, Gary said. His voice was a flat, gravelly drone through the receiver, carrying the exhaustion of a man who had already survived his own ruin. He told her he'd make room for her. He said your marriage had been a business arrangement for 15 years. I looked down at my mother's sewing machine. The white sheet lay on the floor like a discarded skin. How long? I asked. My voice didn't sound like mine. It was too quiet, too steady, like the hum of the furnace through the floorboards. They started at your mother's funeral, Gary said. You were in the kitchen at the church, organizing the ladies from the guild, making sure there were enough ham sandwiches. Calvin went out to the parking lot to help Valerie with her trunk. That's when it started. She was crying. He was the strong brother-in-law. It's an old script, Cheryl. They just ran the lines. And the letters? He rented a box at the UPS store in Granville, under his business name, CS Claims Consulting. He thought he was being smart, using his work credit card to pay for it. But when my lawyer started subpoenaing his expense reports for the deposition, Calvin panicked. That's why Valerie settled so fast. She didn't want him losing his job before she could get up there. Thank you, Gary, I said. Don't thank me, he said, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine pity crept into his voice. She doesn't just want him, Cheryl. She wants the house. She wants the land your dad left you. She told me once that you didn't deserve a place that big when you didn't even know how to live in it. Watch yourself. The line went dead with a soft click. I sat in the dim basement for a long time, the cold of the concrete rising through my shoes. The hardest part of a betrayal is not the lie itself, but the realization that the person you shared a bed with was living an entire parallel life in the spaces between your sentences. For 2 years, Calvin had sat across from me at breakfast, complaining about his lower back, asking if we had enough milk, while in his mind, he was already packing my life into boxes to make room for my sister. By 5 o'clock, the rain had stopped, but the dark had come down early and thick. I was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of chicken broth, when the front door opened. I heard their voices before I saw them, light, animated, carrying the high, nervous energy of a secret shared in public. It handles the wet roads beautifully, Valerie was saying, as she stepped into the kitchen, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. And the heater works so fast, Calvin. It's the copper core, Calvin said, coming in behind her, his coat unbuttoned. He looked relaxed, his eyes bright. The older models have better heater cores than the new ones. I told you it was a solid buy. He saw me standing at the stove. The brightness in his eyes flickered, just for a second, before he settled back into his comfortable defensive shell. Smells good, Cheryl, he said, nodding toward the pot. But actually, I was thinking, since we got the car sorted out, maybe we should celebrate. Let's go to that Italian place in East Grand Rapids, the one with the white tablecloths, my treat. He was offering to buy me dinner with the money he had stolen from my son's tuition. I'm not hungry, I said, not turning away from the steam rising from the pot. But you two should go. You've had a busy day. Calvin hesitated, his hand hovering over his coat pocket. Are you sure? We can bring you back some lasagna. No, thank you, I said. I have some mending to do down in the basement anyway. Valerie looked at me, her eyes dark and watchful under her glossy black bangs. She was standing close to Calvin, her shoulder almost touching his sleeve, her hand resting on the counter near his briefcase. You're always working, Cheryl, she said, her voice dripping with a soft, patronizing pity. You should let yourself rest sometimes. I'll rest when the work is finished, I said. Calvin let out a short, relieved breath. He hadn't wanted me to go anyway. My presence would have been a cold shadow over their bright new toy. All right then, we won't be late. I'm just going to go upstairs and freshen up. He went up the stairs, his heavy steps shaking the ceiling of the kitchen. A moment later, I heard the shower turn on. The pipes rumbled behind the drywall. Valerie stood by the counter, her eyes fixed on my back. I'm going to go change, she said quietly. If you're sure you don't mind. I don't mind, I said. I waited until I heard her bedroom door click shut down the hall. The house was filled with the rush of the shower upstairs and the low hum of the refrigerator. I set the wooden spoon on the counter, walked into the den, and stood before Calvin's roll-top desk. His briefcase sat on the chair, the heavy brown leather bag he had carried for 20 years. It was scuffed at the corners, the brass latches dull. He never locked it. In our house, there had never been any need for locks. My fingers were warm from the stove as I popped the latches. Inside, there were stacks of insurance adjustments, water damage claims for a warehouse in Muskegon, and a half-empty pack of peppermint lozenges. But tucked into the leather sleeve at the back of the case was a small, black, zippered pouch, the kind they give you at the bank to hold deposit slips. I unzipped it. Inside was a spare set of keys for his sedan, a small ledger with his neat, claims adjuster handwriting, and a single brass key stamped with the number 402. Beneath the key was a yellow slip of paper, a receipt from the UPS store on 44th Street in Granville, dated 2 years ago. The receipt was made out to CS Claims Consulting. The monthly fee was $45, paid automatically on the 1st of every month, with a MasterCard ending in 8821. We didn't have a MasterCard ending in 8821. I took the brass key and the receipt, slid them into the pocket of my cardigan, and zipped the black pouch closed. I snapped the latches of the briefcase back into place, smoothing the leather where my fingers had rested. Are you looking for a pen, Cheryl? I didn't freeze. I turned slowly, my hand still resting on the corner of the desk. Valerie was standing in the doorway of the den. She had changed into a dark green knit dress, one that was slightly too tight around her hips, one I had never seen her wear before. Her hair was brushed back, her lips painted a dark, wet red. She was looking at my hand, her eyes sharp, her nostrils flaring slightly, as if she could smell the brass of the key in my pocket. Yes, I said, my voice empty of anything but the cold air in the room. I held up a blue ballpoint pen I had taken from the wooden cup on the desk. I needed to write down the list for the hardware store. The storm window in the basement still has a rattle. Valerie's smile was a thin, paper cut of a thing. She didn't move from the doorway, her dark green knit dress catching the dim light from the hallway. Her eyes remained on my pocket, where the heavy brass key and the yellow paper slip lay flat against my thigh. Calvin's almost ready, she said, her voice dropping into that low, intimate register she usually reserved for him. He's just putting on his shoes. Good, I said, walking toward her. She didn't step back immediately. She waited until I was close enough to smell the sharp jasmine of her perfume, close enough to see the small, satisfied curve of her throat. It was the posture of a woman who believed she had already won, who thought that my silence was the silence of defeat. I stepped past her, my shoulder brushing hers just enough to feel the stiff wool of her coat. 10 minutes later, I stood by the kitchen window and watched the silver Civic back out of the driveway. The red taillights swept across the wet pavement, twin pools of blood in the dark, before the car turned onto the main road and vanished. The house fell into a deep, heavy quiet, the kind of silence that only exists when the people who built the walls are no longer inside them. I didn't waste time. I went to the closet, pulled on my heavy boots, and grabbed my car keys from the hook by the door. The drive to Granville took 18 minutes. The rain had started again, a cold, needle-like drizzle that smeared the yellow glare of the streetlights across my windshield. I drove with the radio off, the only sound the rhythmic thud, thud of the wiper blades. My mind was perfectly clear. I wasn't angry. Anger is an active emotion. It requires energy, and I had spent 30 years exhausting my energy on the small, daily preservation of my family. What I felt now was something much colder, a quiet, systematic detachment. The UPS store sat in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and an empty pizza parlor. The main retail counter was closed for the night, but the outer lobby, where the mailboxes were kept, was open 24 hours a day for box holders. I pushed open the heavy glass door. The lobby was empty, lit by the harsh white glare of fluorescent tubes that flickered with a low electric hum. The air smelled of cardboard boxes, packing tape, and the dry metallic dust of hundreds of tiny aluminum doors. I walked down the third row, box 402. I took the brass key from my pocket. It was cold against my fingers. I slid it into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. I pulled the small metal door open. Inside was a stack of mail, folded in half to fit the narrow space. I pulled it out and set it on the narrow counter beneath the mailboxes. The first 3 envelopes were junk, flyers for a lawn service in Jenison, a pre-approved credit card offer for CS Claims Consulting. But beneath them was a white window envelope from a property management company in East Grand Rapids. I opened it. It was a copy of a lease agreement for a 2-bedroom apartment on Lake Drive, starting December 1st. The monthly rent was $1,800. At the bottom of the page, on the line marked tenant, were 2 signatures written in blue ink: Calvin Vance, Valerie Mitchell. They had signed it 3 weeks ago, 2 days before Valerie called me crying from the motel in Toledo. A husband who intends to leave doesn't build a new life from scratch. He steals the wood from his old home to build the frame of the next one. Calvin hadn't just been comforting my sister. They had been planning the logistics of my replacement while I was folding his laundry. I put the lease agreement in my coat pocket. There was one more envelope at the bottom of the stack. It was a cream-colored, heavy linen envelope with no return address. My name wasn't on it, but the handwriting was Valerie's, that sharp, slanted script I had known since we were girls. It was addressed to Calvin, but it hadn't been mailed. It had been left in the box, likely hand-delivered during one of their emergency meetings. I pulled the single sheet of paper from the envelope. "Calvin, darling," it read. "Gary signed the papers this morning. He was angry, of course, but he's too proud to let anyone know what happened. I'll call Cheryl on Tuesday from the motel. She'll do what she always does. She'll open the door and let me in. She's too soft to say no, and she still thinks she's my mother. Once I'm in the guest room, it won't take long. She's already so tired, Calvin. She doesn't even look at you anymore. We just need to play our parts. Just remember to be patient. We need the equity from the house before we can sign the papers on the Lake Drive place. If she suspects anything, she'll dig her heels in, and you know how stubborn she can be when she thinks she's right. I love you. I'll see you soon. V. I stood in the stark white light of the lobby, the paper rustling slightly in my hand as the furnace kicked on, blowing dry, warm air through the vent above my head. She's too soft to say no. I folded the letter carefully, matching the creases perfectly, and slid it into my pocket beside the lease. I closed the metal door of box 402, locked it, and turned to leave. As I reached the glass exit doors, the headlights of a car swept across the parking lot, the bright beams cutting through the dark and the rain. A dark sedan pulled into the space directly in front of the store, its engine idling with a low, wet rumble. Through the rain-streaked windshield of the sedan, I saw the driver. It wasn't Calvin. It was a young man, his face shadowed by a baseball cap, his eyes fixed on the entrance of the store. He was holding a cell phone to his ear, his mouth moving in quick, sharp sentences. I didn't turn back toward the mailboxes. I pushed open the glass doors of the lobby and stepped out into the cold, wet parking lot. The rain was coming down harder now, bouncing off the asphalt in a dull, chaotic rhythm. The dark sedan's passenger side window rolled down with a slow, mechanical hiss. The young man in the baseball cap leaned toward the opening. He wasn't aggressive. His face was pale, his eyes tired, and he looked like a man who had spent too many hours sitting in a cold car. "Mrs. Vance?" he asked. His voice was polite, carrying a slight Midwestern drawl. I stopped near the front bumper of his car, my hand in my coat pocket, my fingers still touching the crease of Valerie's letter. "Who are you?" "My name is Curtis," he said. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet, flipping it open to show a laminated card. "I'm a licensed investigator with Northern Lake Security. I was hired by Gary Mitchell's legal team 3 months ago." I looked at the card, then back at his face. "Gary told me he had a lawyer." "He does," Curtis said, nodding. He reached onto the passenger seat and picked up a thick, white Tyvek envelope, holding it out through the open window. "Gary called me after you spoke to him. He told me to hand this to you if you ever reached out. He said he didn't want you to be the only one left in the dark." The rain was cold on my bare hand as I took the envelope. It had some weight to it, the stiff plastic crinkling under my fingers. "What's in here?" I asked. "Dates, times, mileage logs," Curtis said, his voice flat, professional, and completely detached from the wreckage he was delivering. "Photos of your husband's car at the Red Roof Inn in Battle Creek, the Fairfield in Lansing. Bank transfer records showing Calvin moving funds from your joint account to an account Valerie opened under her maiden name in Toledo. It's all certified. It's already been entered into Gary's court record as evidence of marital waste and third-party involvement." He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes softening just a fraction under the brim of his cap. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance," he said quietly. "Usually the spouses are the first to know. But your sister, she's very good at what she does. She spent 3 months making sure Gary looked like the unstable one before she ever moved her first suitcase." "Thank you, Curtis," I said. He nodded, rolled up his window, and backed the sedan out of the space. I stood in the wet parking lot, holding the envelope against my chest, and watched his red taillights disappear into the dark. By the time I got back to the house, it was nearly 8 o'clock. The silver Civic was in the driveway, its hood cold now, covered in a thin skin of rainwater. I went inside through the mudroom, my boots heavy on the linoleum. The house was dark, save for the single light above the kitchen sink. I sat at the kitchen island, still wearing my wet coat, and opened the Tyvek envelope. I didn't turn on the kitchen lights. I used the small lamp on the counter, the warm, yellow glow illuminating the sheets of white paper. The photos were clear. Curtis's camera had a high-powered lens that caught the rust on the bottom of Calvin's car doors, the steam rising from the exhaust, and the exact expression on his face as he walked out of a motel lobby in Battle Creek, carrying a paper bag of ice. Valerie was walking beside him, her long black hair damp, wearing the same gray cashmere sweater she had worn at our dinner table. The dates went back 18 months. They had been meeting on Tuesdays, the days Calvin told me he had out-of-town adjustments in Kalamazoo. He had been using his company car, his company gas card, and our shared life to pay for their Tuesday afternoons. But the bank records were what made me sit perfectly still. Calvin hadn't just taken $4,800 yesterday. He had been transferring small amounts, $400 here, $600 there, for over a year. It was always labeled as maintenance or home repair. I had never questioned it because I trusted him, and because I was too busy keeping the house clean, making sure the oil was changed in the lawnmower, and typing Mitchell's college applications to look at the ledger. Some betrayals are so large that they cease to feel like personal injuries. They feel like weather, massive, cold, and entirely indifferent to the shelter you spent your life building. I heard the garage door opener groan. I didn't panic. I carefully slid the photos and the ledger sheets back into the Tyvek envelope, walked into the den, and slid it into the space behind the bookcase where I kept my father's old encyclopedias. I was back in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water, when the back door opened. They came in together, laughing. Calvin was holding a plastic container of leftover pasta, and Valerie had a small paper bag from a bakery. They smelled of garlic, red wine, and the cold, fresh air of the outside world. "You're still up," Calvin said, his smile faltering slightly as he saw me standing by the sink. He set the leftovers on the counter. "We brought you some garlic bread from the East Hills place." "Thank you," I said. I took a sip of water. My voice was perfectly calm, perfectly level. Valerie looked at me, her eyes darting to my coat, which was still draped over the back of the kitchen chair, damp from the rain. "Did you go out, Cheryl?" "I had to go to the pharmacy," I said, "for my joint medication." "Oh," she said, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. She set her bakery bag on the counter. "You should have told us. We could have picked it up for you on the way back." "I like to do things myself," I said. I turned to Calvin. I looked at his eyes, which were slightly glassy from the wine. "Calvin," I said, "since you already withdrew the $4,800 from the savings for Valerie's car, I think we should finalize the paperwork for it tomorrow." He froze, his hand still on the refrigerator door. The quiet hum of the appliance seemed to grow louder in the silence of the kitchen. "The paperwork?" he asked, his voice tightening. "What paperwork? It's a family loan, Cheryl." "It's Mitchell's tuition money," I said, my voice soft, almost conversational. "If we're going to treat it as a loan, we need a formal promissory note. And since Valerie has no assets, you'll need to co-sign it, Calvin." "I'm not signing a contract with my own sister-in-law," he said, his face flushing red, his defensive anger rising like a wall. "That's ridiculous. It's $5,000, Cheryl. We're not bank examiners." "It's a matter of record," I said, "and as guarantor, I want a post-nuptial agreement releasing any marital claim you might have on this house." The kitchen fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. Calvin's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Valerie stood behind him, her face turning a pale, sickly gray under the fluorescent light of the sink. She looked at Calvin, then at me, her fingers twisting the plastic of her bakery bag until it tore. "The house?" Calvin whispered. "What does the house have to do with $5,000? "My father built this house," I said, looking at him with a quiet, steady intensity that made him step back a fraction. "And if we're going to start drawing from our retirement assets to support your family, I want to make sure my father's work stays with Mitchell. It's very simple, Calvin. You sign the release, and I won't report the unauthorized withdrawal to the credit union." "Report me?" Calvin's voice rose, cracking slightly as he took a step toward me, his fingers still clutching the container of leftover pasta. "It's my joint account, Cheryl. I have a legal right to withdraw those funds. It's my name on the signature card." "You do," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it seemed to fill the room, pushing against the high yellow walls. "And you also had a legal right to tell me the truth, but you didn't. You told me it was an emergency. You told me Valerie was destitute." I turned my eyes to my sister. She was standing frozen by the counter, her fingers still holding the torn edge of the bakery bag. "But she isn't destitute, is she, Valerie?" I asked. "You don't need a $5,000 loan from my son's college fund. Not when you have $48,000 sitting in a Fifth Third account in Toledo." Calvin stopped, his brow furrowed, his mouth opening slightly as he looked from me to Valerie. The flush of anger in his neck seemed to freeze, turning a dull, mottled purple. "48,000?" he repeated, his voice dropping. He looked at Valerie, his expression a mixture of confusion and a sudden, sharp panic. "What is she talking about, Val? You told me Gary locked you out of the accounts. You told me you had $42 in your purse when you got to the motel." "She's lying," Valerie stammered, her voice high and thin, her face turning a pale, sickly green under the fluorescent light of the sink. "Gary's telling her lies to turn her against me. You know how he is, Calvin. He's vindictive." "Gary didn't tell me," I said, my voice cold and steady. "I found your divorce file in the basement, Valerie, in the cardboard box with our mother's calico fabric. The financial disclosures are very clear. You filed for the divorce, you got the townhome, and you got the cash settlement. You've had that money since September." Calvin turned fully toward her now. The container of leftover pasta slipped from his hand, hitting the linoleum with a heavy, wet thud. The plastic lid popped off, and the red sauce began to bleed across the clean floor, but neither of them looked at it. "You had $48,000? Calvin whispered. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, the image of the delicate, wounded bird he had spent 18 months protecting, dissolving into the cold kitchen air. "You let me take the money from Mitchell's account? You let me face Cheryl? You let me lie to her when you had 50 grand in the bank?" "Calvin, listen to me," Valerie said, stepping toward him, her hands reaching out, her dark eyes wide with a frantic, desperate pleading. "I had to protect that money, for our future, for the apartment on Lake Drive. If I spent my own money, Gary's lawyers would have asked questions during the final property division. I did it for us." She said the words before she could stop herself. The name of the apartment hung in the quiet kitchen like a physical weight. Calvin's shoulders sagged. He looked at the red sauce spreading across the linoleum, then back at Valerie, his face empty of anything but a profound, pathetic exhaustion. He had spent 2 years believing he was a knight in shining armor, only to realize he was just the labor hired to move the furniture. "We'll talk about this in the morning," Calvin said, his voice barely audible. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Valerie. He turned on his heel and walked slowly down the hallway, his boots heavy and flat against the wood. A moment later, the door to the guest room opened and closed, the quiet click of the latch final and cold. The next morning, the house was freezing. The wind was still blowing from the north, rattling the loose pane in the kitchen window. I came down the stairs at 6:30, my wool shawl wrapped tight around my shoulders. Valerie was already sitting at the kitchen island. She wasn't wearing her satin robe today. She was dressed in her dark green knit dress from the night before, her hair brushed back into a tight, glossy ponytail. She had a mug of black coffee in front of her, her fingers wrapping around the ceramic as if she were trying to draw some warmth from it. The mess on the floor had been cleaned up, the linoleum wiped down, but the faint smell of garlic and vinegar still hung in the cold air. She didn't look up when I entered. She waited until I had filled the kettle and set it on the stove before she spoke. "You think you've won, Cheryl," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the soft, breathless quality she had used for the last month. It was her real voice, sharp, hard, and old. "I didn't know we were playing a game, Valerie," I said, not turning around. "Calvin's not going to sign that post-nuptial agreement," she said. "I've already talked to him. He's weak, but he's not stupid. He knows his rights." I turned slowly, my hands resting on the edge of the counter. His rights? Under Michigan law, even if this house was inherited, it's been the marital home for 28 years, she said, a small, cold smile touching the corners of her mouth. Marital funds were used to pay the taxes, to repair the roof, to pave the driveway. Calvin's lawyer says he's entitled to half the appreciation of this property over the course of the marriage. That's worth a lot more than $4,800, Cheryl. She leaned forward, her dark eyes fixing on mine with a quiet, venomous intensity. "If you try to kick me out, or if you go to the credit union, we'll just leave," she whispered. "The lease on Lake Drive starts on the 1st anyway, but Calvin will file for divorce, and he'll ask for his share of this house. You'll have to sell it, Cheryl. You'll have to sell this big, yellow house your father built just to pay him his half, and you'll be left with nothing." She took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes never leaving my face. "So you see," she said, her voice dropping to a low, satisfied murmur, "you're going to let me stay here until the 1st. And you're going to let Calvin keep that money. Because if you don't, I'll make sure you lose the only thing you actually care about." A conspiracy of two is only as strong as the thinnest lie between them. But when the partners in crime realize they are both trapped, they don't look for an exit. They look for a way to make sure everyone else burns with them. I looked at her. I looked at the glossy black hair, the dark green dress, the cold, hard eyes of my younger sister. "The kettle is boiling," I said. I poured the boiling water into my mug, watching the dark tea leaves swirl and rise to the surface. The steam warmed my face, but it couldn't reach the coldness that had settled deep inside my bones. "Enjoy your coffee, Valerie," I said. I didn't wait for her to reply. I carried my mug down the hall, my steps slow and deliberate, and went out to my car. The downtown streets of Grand Rapids were wet, the tires of my sedan humming a low, steady song against the asphalt. I parked in a parking structure near the county courthouse, where the concrete was stained with salt and the cold air smelled of exhaust. Denise Fletcher's office was on the 4th floor of an old brick building on Ottawa Avenue. It was a quiet place, the waiting room furnished with heavy oak chairs and stacks of old legal journals. Denise was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp graying hair and eyes that had seen every imaginable configuration of human selfishness. She didn't speak while she reviewed the contents of the Tyvek envelope. She laid the photographs of Calvin and Valerie out on her desk like a deck of cards, her fingers moving them into neat, chronological rows. Then she turned her attention to the bank statements and the copy of the Lake Drive lease. "Your sister's lawyer is using a standard scare tactic," Denise said, leaning back in her leather chair. She took off her reading glasses and let them hang on the chain around her neck. Under Michigan law, inherited property is indeed separate. However, if marital funds or significant marital labor were used to maintain or improve the property, the non-owning spouse can claim a portion of the appreciation. "They've been paying the property taxes from our joint account," I said. "Yes," Denise said, nodding, "but look at what we have in this envelope, Cheryl. This isn't just an affair. This is systematic marital waste. Calvin has spent almost $25,000 of your marital assets over the last 18 months to fund his relationship with your sister. He bought her a car with money designated for your son's education. He's been paying for motels, dinners, and likely her legal fees in Toledo, all from your joint savings. She tapped her finger on the photo of Calvin carrying Valerie's bags into the Battle Creek Motel. In a division of assets, a judge will look at this waste and deduct it directly from Calvin's share of any marital property, Denise explained. Furthermore, the appreciation on an inherited home is not automatic. We can argue that the upkeep was passive and that his financial contributions were more than offset by the rent-free living he enjoyed for 28 years. So he can't force me to sell the house? I asked. Not easily, Denise said, but if we file for divorce today, your sister and your husband will dig in. They'll stay in your house, they'll lock themselves in the guest room, and they'll make your life a living hell for the next 6 months while the court sorting is done. It will be loud, it will be ugly, and it will exhaust you. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine with a quiet, strategic intensity. The lease on their Lake Drive apartment starts on December 1st, she said. That's 2 weeks from now. My advice? Let them think they've won. Let them believe you are frightened of their legal threats. Let them pack their bags and move into that apartment. Why? Because the moment Calvin moves his physical belongings into an apartment with another woman, he has established cohabitation, Denise said, a cold, hard smile touching her mouth. That completely eliminates any claim he might have for temporary spousal support, and it simplifies our case enormously. On December 2nd, we serve him with the divorce papers at his new address. We lock the doors of your house, we change the cylinders, and we file a motion to freeze his pension and his bank accounts for marital waste. By the time he realizes what's happened, he'll be sitting in an $1,800 a month apartment with no access to your money and no way to get back into your house. The most dangerous time to fight a thief is when they think they've already gotten away with the loot. If you let them celebrate, they stop looking behind them. I can wait 2 weeks, I said. When I returned home, the silver Civic was gone. Valerie had likely gone to the grocery store or to Toledo for some final legal errand. But Calvin's sedan was in the driveway. I found him sitting at the dining room table. The drapes were drawn, the room dark save for the light from the hallway. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him, but it was empty. He was just sitting there, his hands resting flat on the dark oak wood, staring at the wall. He looked smaller. The bluster and anger of the night before had drained out of him, leaving only the pale, wrinkled skin of a man who was beginning to understand the weight of the trap he had stepped into. He looked up as I entered. His eyes were bloodshot, his mouth twitching slightly. "Mitchell called," he said. His voice was dry, cracking on the name of our son. I stopped near the archway, my coat still on. "Mitchell?" "His flight gets into Ford Airport on Wednesday afternoon," Calvin said. He swallowed hard, his hand going to his collar. "For Thanksgiving. He wants to know if we need him to bring anything. He said he's excited to see his Aunt Valerie." The air in the room grew suddenly thick, heavy with the weight of the family holiday that was now only 6 days away. Mitchell was coming home. The son who had spent his summers working at the lumberyard to help pay for his books. The son who believed his father was a good, quiet man who worked hard and kept his head down. He was coming to sit at our Thanksgiving table, to eat the turkey I would roast, to share a roof with the father and the aunt who had stolen his tuition money to buy a silver car. Calvin looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading. He didn't say the words, but I could see them written in the lines around his mouth, in the desperate, trembling tilt of his chin. "Don't tell him." He was begging me to help him keep the secret. He was begging me to let him play the role of the proud father for just 3 days, to let him sit at the head of the table and carve the turkey, while the red rot of his betrayal remained hidden beneath the tablecloth. I looked at him, and for the first time in 28 years, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, no lingering thread of the affection that had once bound me to him. He was just a stranger sitting in my father's house, waiting for the winter to come. "I'll make the stuffing on Tuesday," I said. On Monday and Tuesday, the house smelled of celery, toasted white bread, and the sharp, earthy scent of sage. Valerie was on her best behavior. She polished the silver gravy boat that had belonged to our mother, her fingers moving in slow, rhythmic circles with the flannel cloth. She was quiet, polite, and almost sisterly again, her voice soft and deferential whenever she asked me where the linen napkins were kept. She believed she had won. She believed she had mapped out the boundaries of my fear, and that I was willing to let her stay in my guest room, let Calvin keep the stolen tuition money, and let them move into their Lake Drive apartment on the 1st without a fight. Calvin was a ghost. He came and went with a quiet, shuffling step, his eyes never resting on mine for more than a second. He was terrified. Every time the phone rang, or every time I reached for my purse, I could see the muscles in his jaw tighten, his breath catching as he waited for the axe to fall. He was living in the space between the lie and the consequence, and it was the most uncomfortable room in the house. On Wednesday afternoon, the sky over Grand Rapids was a thick, bruising purple, carrying the promise of the season's first real snow. Calvin and I rode to Gerald R. Ford International Airport in absolute silence. The only sound was the cold wind whistling through the door seal of the sedan and the steady, heavy rumble of the tires on the highway. We stood near the security gate, surrounded by families holding signs, children bouncing on their heels, and the warm, stale smell of airport cinnamon rolls. "There he is," Calvin muttered, his voice tight, his hand rising to wave. Mitchell was walking through the gate, his heavy canvas backpack slung over one shoulder, his winter coat unbuttoned. He was 26, but he still had the same quick, easy stride he had when he was a boy running down our driveway. He looked healthy, his skin tanned from the Colorado sun, his hair cut short and neat. "Mom," he said, his face breaking into a wide, genuine smile as he wrapped his arms around me. He smelled of cold air, jet fuel, and the laundry detergent he used in Denver. "You feel smaller." "I'm fine, Mitchell," I said, burying my face in his wool shoulder for just a second. "I'm so glad you're home." He pulled back and hugged Calvin. It was a shorter hug, the kind men give each other when they aren't sure how much emotion is permitted. Calvin gripped Mitchell's shoulder with a sudden, desperate strength, his fingers digging into the fabric of his coat as if he were trying to anchor himself to his son's goodness. "Good to see you, Mitch," Calvin said, his voice thick. "Good to have you back." On the drive home, Mitchell sat in the back seat, his knees pressed against the map pockets of our chairs. He was full of talk about his job at the engineering firm, the mountain trails he had hiked in October, the small apartment he had rented in Capitol Hill. "So, Dad," Mitchell said, leaning forward between our seats, his elbows resting on the console. "About that email you sent me last month." I saw Calvin's hands tighten on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white in the gray light of the dashboard. "What email, Mitchell?" I asked, my voice quiet, conversational. "Mitch, we don't need to talk about that now," Calvin said quickly, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror, his voice rising a fraction too high. "Your mother's been tired, and we're just glad you're home for the holiday. Let's focus on dinner." "No, it's just," Mitchell continued, looking from Calvin to me, his brow furrowing with a sudden, quiet confusion. Dad sent me an email saying the household budget was really tight because of some medical expenses and that I shouldn't bring up the graduate school funds around you, Mom. He said it would stress you out. I just wanted to make sure you're okay. Are you sick? The silence in the front seat was like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. Calvin had preemptively blocked Mitchell from asking me about his tuition. He had used my supposed illness and stress as a shield to hide the fact that he had already emptied the account to buy a silver car for my sister. He had made his own son feel guilty for wanting to use the money we had promised him, all to protect the woman sleeping in our guest room. "I'm perfectly healthy, Mitchell," I said, my voice as smooth and cold as a sheet of ice. "Your father was just being protective. We have plenty of money for your graduate school. We'll transfer the funds to your account on Friday morning, right after the holiday." Calvin let out a sharp, ragged breath that sounded like a sob, but he kept his eyes fixed on the gray highway ahead of us. "Oh," Mitchell said, leaning back in his seat, his shoulders relaxing. "Okay, good." I was worried. Dad made it sound like we were on the edge of bankruptcy. "We're fine," I said. "Everything is exactly where it belongs." We arrived at the house at 5 o'clock. Valerie was waiting at the front door. She was wearing a soft, cream-colored apron over her green dress, her long black hair pulled back with a tortoiseshell clip. She looked like the very picture of the grateful, helpful guest, her face shining with a warm, ant-like affection as Mitchell came up the steps. "Mitchell!" she cried, reaching out to hug him. "Look at you! You're so tall! You look just like your grandfather." "Hi, Aunt Val," Mitchell said, hugging her politely. "I'm sorry to hear about everything in Toledo. Mom said you were staying with us for a bit." "It's been a blessing," Valerie said, her eyes shifting to Calvin for a split second before returning to Mitchell's face. "Your parents have been so incredibly generous to me." "That's what family does," Mitchell said, repeating the phrase Calvin had used to justify his theft. Because Valerie was in the guest room, Mitchell was sleeping on the pull-out sofa in the den. Late that evening, after the turkey was prepped and the house had grown quiet, I went into the den to bring Mitchell some extra pillows. He was in his t-shirt and pajama pants, clearing his bags off the green velvet sofa to pull the mattress out. The den was dark, the only light coming from the brass reading lamp in the corner. "Thanks, Mom," Mitchell said, taking the pillows from my arms. He set them on the desk. He looked at the heavy oak bookcase that lined the far wall, where my father's old encyclopedias sat in a neat, leather-bound row. "I was looking for something to read," Mitchell said, pointing to the shelf. "I forgot how many of Grandfather's old books you kept. But there's a weird envelope stuck behind the M volume. It looks like a legal package." He reached his hand toward the shelf, his fingers hovering just inches from the Tyvek envelope that contained the photographs of his father's betrayal. "That's just some legal paperwork regarding your grandfather's estate," I said. I moved quickly, my boots silent on the carpet, and took the Tyvek envelope from the shelf before his fingers could touch the plastic. I slid it under my arm, my movements smooth and unhurried. "I've been meaning to move it to the filing cabinet in the basement. The probate lawyer used a courier service, and they always use those heavy envelopes." Mitchell looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the stiff, defensive way I held my elbow against my side. "An estate lawyer out of Toledo?" He had seen the return address on the label. "They had to coordinate with the Ohio branch of the family," I said, offering him a small, reassuring smile that didn't reach my eyes. "It's dry stuff, Mitchell. Tax receipts and land surveys from 40 years ago. Nothing for you to worry about." He looked at me for a long moment, his hand still resting on the edge of the bookcase. He was too smart, too observant, and he had spent his entire life watching me smooth over the rough edges of our family. He could smell the tension in the room, even if he couldn't see the fire. "Are you sure you're okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, quiet murmur. You and Dad. It's like you're speaking a different language. He looks like he's about to jump out of his skin every time you walk into the room. Your father has a lot of pressure at work, I said. I patted his arm, the cotton of his t-shirt warm under my palm. And having your Aunt Valerie here is a big change for everyone. But we're fine. Get some sleep, Mitchell. Tomorrow is a busy day. He sighed, his shoulders dropping. Okay, good night, Mom. Good night, Mitchell. I carried the Tyvek envelope down to the basement, locked it in my mother's old metal sewing box, and hid the key in the pocket of my gardening apron. When I went back upstairs, the house was dark and silent. But as I passed the guest room, I heard the faint, muffled sound of a keyboard clicking behind the closed door. Thanksgiving morning was bright and cold, the morning sun casting long, pale shadows across the frost-covered grass of the backyard. The kitchen was warm, filled with the heavy, rich scent of the roasting turkey, the sweet smell of the candied yams, and the sharp aroma of coffee. Valerie was at the sink, washing the crystal wine glasses we only used once a year. She was humming a soft, cheerful tune under her breath. I can do the gravy, Cheryl, she said as I walked in. She didn't turn around, her hands busy in the soapy water. Calvin always liked my gravy better anyway. He says yours is a little too heavy on the sage. Go ahead, I said. I sat at the kitchen island, holding my mug of tea. I watched her back, the way the dark green knit dress clung to her waist, the ease with which she moved through my kitchen. A parasite doesn't hate the host. It actually loves the host, in its own way. It loves the warmth, the food, the shelter. It only becomes destructive when it forgets that the host must survive for the parasite to live. Valerie didn't want to destroy my life. She just wanted to slide into the warm space I had spent 30 years hollowed out for myself, while I was politely moved to the basement. Calvin and Mitchell were in the living room, watching the parade on television. Calvin was laughing loudly at the commentators' jokes, too loudly, his voice carrying an edge of frantic, desperate cheer that made Mitchell look at him sideways. He was trying to buy his son's affection with volume, trying to drown out the silence that was slowly rising around him. By 2 o'clock, the table was set. The silver gravy boat sat in the center of the dark oak wood, surrounded by the white linen napkins and the polished crystal. Calvin sat at the head of the table, his carving knife sharp, his face pale but determined. Mitchell sat to his right, and Valerie sat opposite him, her face shining with a warm domestic glow. It looks beautiful, Cheryl, Valerie said, raising her wine glass. We have so much to be thankful for this year. Yes, I said, we do. Calvin carved the turkey, his hands shaking slightly as he transferred the thick slices of white meat to Mitchell's plate. There you go, son, the breast, just the way you like it. Thanks, Dad, Mitchell said. We ate in a quiet, polite routine. Mitchell talked about the snow in Denver, and Valerie shared her plans to look for a small apartment in East Hills. Calvin says the area is very up and coming, she said, her voice bright and innocent. Lots of little shops and restaurants. Calvin swallowed hard, his fork scraping against his plate with a sharp, metallic screech. It's a nice area, he muttered, not looking at me. Suddenly, Mitchell's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, frowning at the screen as he chewed his turkey. That's weird, he murmured, his thumb scrolling through a notification. What is it, Mitch? Calvin asked, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth, his eyes darting to his son's face. It's an email from the Lake Michigan Credit Union, Mitchell said, his brow furrowing as he read. I set up the automated transfer for my graduate school tuition earlier today like you said, Mom, but the system just sent me a failure notice. It says the joint savings account has been locked due to an administrative hold. Calvin's face went completely, bloodlessly white. He set his fork down, but his fingers were shaking so badly it slipped, clattering against the edge of his plate and falling onto the white tablecloth, leaving a small, dark grease stain. "Locked?" Calvin whispered, his voice barely a breath. Mitchell looked at me, his eyes filled with a sudden, sharp confusion. "Mom, did you freeze the account?" "Yes, Mitchell," I said, my voice perfectly level, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of my wine glass. "I had the credit union place a temporary hold on the account on Tuesday morning." The dining room was so quiet, I could hear the rhythmic click, click, click of the cooling stove in the kitchen. "But why?" Mitchell asked, his eyes moving from my face to Calvin's, his brow furrowing with a sudden, sharp suspicion. "Dad said the money was there. He said you were just stressed about the budget." "We had some unusual activity on the account over the last few weeks," I said, looking directly at Calvin. "A large withdrawal was made without my consent, and I wanted to make sure our assets were secure before we made any major transfers. I'm sure your father understands." Calvin looked as though he were swallowing glass. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. "It was an emergency, Mitchell," Calvin stammered, his voice thin and desperate, his eyes pleading with his son. "Your Aunt Valerie's car was shot. It wasn't safe. I had to use the emergency fund to get her something reliable. It's a loan, remember. We talked about this, Cheryl." "A loan?" Mitchell's voice rose, a hard, angry edge cutting through the quiet room. He set his fork down with a sharp clack. "Dad, you sent me an email last month telling me the account was tight because of Mom's medical bills. Now you're saying you withdrew $5,000 of my tuition money to buy Aunt Valerie a car? And you didn't even tell Mom?" "Mitchell, please," Valerie said, her voice dropping into that soft, breathless register, her hands reaching out in a gesture of gentle, wounded innocence. "Your father was only trying to help me. I was desperate. Gary took everything, and I didn't have a way to get to my court dates. I had no idea it was your school money, truly." Mitchell turned to her. He was 26, and he had his grandfather's sharp, analytical mind. He didn't look at her with sympathy. He looked at her with a cold, measuring scrutiny. "If you have a townhome in Toledo, Aunt Valerie, and a pending divorce settlement, why didn't you take out a personal loan?" Mitchell asked, his voice flat. "Why did my father have to empty my college account? And why did he lie to me about medical bills?" "Mitchell, that's enough," Calvin said, trying to summon a fatherly authority he no longer possessed. "You don't understand the details. Your aunt was in a crisis." "No, Dad, I think I understand the details perfectly," Mitchell said. He stood up from the table, his chair scraping loud against the hardwood floor. He looked at Calvin, then at Valerie, his face empty of anything but a profound, young disgust. "I'm going to take a walk." "Mitch, wait," Calvin begged, half rising from his chair. "Don't," Mitchell said. He walked out of the dining room, his heavy steps echoing down the hallway. A moment later, the front door opened and closed with a firm, solid thud, letting in a sudden gust of freezing November air that made the candles on the table flicker and smoke. The silence that followed was absolute. Valerie sat perfectly still, her face pale, her dark eyes fixed on her plate. Calvin collapsed back into his chair, his shoulders slumping, his head dropping into his hands. "You did this on purpose," Valerie whispered, her voice sharp and venomous as she looked up at me. "You wanted to humiliate him in front of his son. You wanted to turn Mitchell against us." I didn't turn Mitchell against anyone, Valerie, I said, taking a quiet sip of my water. Your own lies did that, and Calvin's cowardice. I simply protected my father's money. You're a monster, Cheryl, she spat, her fingers twisting her linen napkin into a tight, wrinkled knot. You sit there so quiet, acting like you're the victim, while you systematically ruin everyone else's life. I spent 30 years building this life, I said, my voice dropping to a low, cold whisper that made her flinch. I spent 30 years washing your clothes, cleaning up your messes, and making sure my husband had a home to come back to. I didn't ruin anything. I'm just stopping the leak. I stood up, took my plate, and carried it into the kitchen. Calvin followed me. He stepped through the archway, his face gray and withered, looking like a man who had survived a shipwreck only to realize he was stranded on a barren rock. He stood by the refrigerator, his hands shaking, his voice cracking when he spoke. Cheryl, please, he whispered, his eyes wide and wet. I'll sign the post-nuptial agreement. I'll sign whatever your lawyer wants. Just call the credit union and release the hold. Let Mitchell have his tuition. He has to register for classes by Tuesday. Don't punish him for what I did. A man who begs for mercy only after he's caught is not sorry he hurt you. He is only sorry that he can no longer use your trust as a shield. It's too late for the post-nup, Calvin, I said, not looking at him as I scraped the leftovers into the trash. The legal paperwork is already being drafted. We'll discuss the credit union on Monday. What does that mean? He asked, his voice rising in panic. Cheryl, what are you doing? I'm finishing dinner, I said. Mitchell was gone for nearly 2 hours. By the time he returned, the kitchen had been cleaned, the leftovers packed away, and the house had settled into that freezing, heavy silence that always preceded the snow. Calvin and Valerie had retreated to their respective rooms, the doors closed, the lights beneath them dark. I was sitting in the den, knitting a green wool scarf under the brass reading lamp. The front door clicked open, and Mitchell stepped into the room. His cheeks were red from the cold, his hair damp with the light snow that had begun to fall outside. He didn't take off his coat. He walked into the den and sat on the edge of the pull-out sofa. In his hand, he was holding a small, crumpled slip of paper. "Mom," he said, his voice shaking with a terrible, quiet grief. "I was looking for some packing tape in the desk drawer to fix my duffel bag." He held up the paper. It was a printed email dated 2 weeks ago that Calvin had carelessly left in the back of the drawer. "It's from Dad's work email," Mitchell whispered, his eyes wet as he looked at me. "To Aunt Valerie. It's about a lease on Lake Drive. He tells her he's transferring $5,000 from my account to pay the deposit, and that once they move in on the 1st, they won't have to pretend anymore." He looked at the floor, his shoulders shaking. "Mom, is Dad having an affair with Aunt Valerie?" I set my knitting down on the small table beside my chair. The green wool looked dark, almost black, under the yellow glare of the reading lamp. I looked at my son, at the damp hair clinging to his forehead, at the terrible young grief in his eyes. "Yes, Mitchell," I said, "it's true." He didn't yell. He didn't slam his hand against the desk. He just sat there, his head dropping slowly into his hands, his shoulders shaking beneath his flannel shirt. He was 26 years old, an adult who had lived on his own for 4 years, but in that moment, he looked like the 10-year-old boy who had fallen off his bicycle in our driveway, waiting for me to tell him the bleeding would stop. I sat beside him on the edge of the pull-out sofa. I didn't hug him. I knew he didn't want to be comforted. He wanted to understand. "I've known for 3 weeks," I said quietly, "ever since Valerie arrived." 3 weeks? Mitchell looked up, his eyes red and wet, his face twisted in disbelief. "And you let her stay here? You let her sit at our table? You let him carve the turkey today, Mom. Why?" Why didn't you throw them out the moment you found out? Because of the law, Mitchell, I said, my voice as calm and steady as a heartbeat. Your father has been planning this for 2 years. He and Valerie have a lease on an apartment on Lake Drive that starts on December 1st. If I had thrown them out 3 weeks ago, your father would have filed for divorce immediately. He would have claimed half the appreciation of this house, and he would have tied up our assets in court for months. My lawyer told me to wait. To wait for what? For him to move out, I said. Once he establishes cohabitation in that apartment on December 1st, he loses his claim to temporary spousal support, and we serve him at his new address on December 2nd. We lock the doors, we change the cylinders, and we protect the house your grandfather built. I was playing the long game, Mitchell, but your father's carelessness ruined the timeline. Mitchell stared at the crumpled email in his hand. He stole my tuition, Mom, he whispered, a tear finally sliding down his nose. He lied to me about you being sick so I wouldn't ask for the money. He made me feel like a burden. I know, I said, reaching out to wipe the wetness from his cheek. But he's not going to keep it. I've already locked the joint account. On Friday, my lawyer is filing an emergency motion to freeze his pension for marital waste. You will get your money, Mitchell. I promise you. He stood up slowly. The grief in his face was gone, replaced by a cold, hard anger that made him look older, more like my father than his own. Where are they? He asked. Mitchell, don't, I said, standing up with him. Let them go. The lease starts in 10 days. We just need to get through next week. No, Mitchell said, his voice flat and absolute. I'm not sleeping under the same roof as them tonight, and neither are you. He walked out of the den before I could stop him, his boots heavy and fast on the hardwood floor. He didn't go to the kitchen. He went straight down the hallway to the guest room and knocked. Not a polite tap, but 3 heavy, booming blows that shook the drywall. The door opened almost immediately. Calvin stood in the doorway, wearing his gray undershirt and his pajama pants. He looked tired, his eyes blinking against the light of the hallway. When he saw Mitchell standing there, the crumpled papers still clutched in his hand, his mouth opened slightly, his chest rising in a quick, shallow breath. Mitch, Calvin stammered, his hand going to the doorframe to steady himself. What's going on? Mitchell didn't say a word. He held up the printed email, shoving it within inches of his father's face. Is this yours? Mitchell asked, his voice trembling but cold. Calvin looked at the paper. He didn't have to read it. He recognized his own office letterhead, his own signature block. He looked past Mitchell to where I was standing in the hallway, his eyes wide with a frantic, silent terror. Mitch, let me explain, Calvin whispered, reaching out a hand. It's not what it looks like. Your aunt was in a bad place, and I was just trying to— Don't touch me, Mitchell said, stepping back, his voice rising, filling the narrow hallway like thunder. You stole my tuition money. You lied to me about my mother being sick, and you're sleeping with her sister, in my grandfather's house. Valerie stepped into the light behind Calvin. She had a wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her long black hair messy, her face pale. She looked at Mitchell, her eyes dark and watchful. Mitchell, please, she said, her voice dropping into that soft, pleading register. Your father and I, we didn't want to hurt anyone. We were going to tell your mother after the holiday. I don't want to hear a single word from you, Mitchell spat, turning on her. You're a thief, Aunt Valerie. You've been stealing from my mother since Grandmama's funeral. You moved into this house like a parasite. Get out. Mitch, you can't talk to her like that, Calvin said, trying to summon some defense, but his voice was weak, empty of any real conviction. I can say whatever I want, Mitchell said, stepping closer to his father, his chest nearly touching Calvin's. "You're going to pack your bags, and you're going to pack her bags, and you're going to leave this house tonight. If you're still here in 20 minutes, I'm calling the police and reporting the unauthorized bank withdrawal, and I'm showing them this email from your company's server. Let's see how your regional manager feels about you using the corporate database to manage your mistress's lease." Calvin looked at his son, then at me. I stood at the end of the hallway, my arms folded across my chest, my face perfectly blank. He saw that there was no shelter left for him here. No quiet smoothing over, no domestic patience, no wife to clean up the glass. "All right," Calvin whispered, his shoulders dropping. "All right, we'll go." It took them 28 minutes to pack. The house was filled with the sound of drawers opening and closing, the heavy scrape of zippers, and the quiet, hurried whispers of two people who had been caught in the dark. Mitchell stood by the front door, his arms crossed, watching the hallway like a sentry. At 11:30, they came out. Calvin had his large suitcase and his briefcase. Valerie was carrying two smaller bags, her wool coat buttoned to her chin, her face a cold, hard mask of hatred as she looked at me. The front door opened, letting in the heavy, swirling snow that had begun to cover the driveway. Calvin stopped on the threshold. He looked at me, his eyes hollow, but there was a sudden, sharp desperation in them, the look of a claims adjuster who had spent his life calculating the cost of ruins and had finally found a way to make someone else pay for the fire. "You think you've won, Cheryl," he said, his teeth chattering in the cold wind. "You think you've got everything figured out with your lawyer, but I've been with the company for 25 years. I know how to write a loss report, and I know what this house is worth on paper. If you try to freeze my pension, I'll file a claim on this property that will tie up the deed until Mitchell is 40. I know how to handle you." He turned and stepped out into the snow, closing the door behind him with a heavy, final thud. The silence that followed their departure was different from the quiet we had lived with for years. It wasn't the comfortable, dusty stillness of an empty nest. It was the cold, hollow silence of a house that had just been gutted by a storm. Mitchell sat on the green velvet sofa in the den, his elbows on his knees, staring at the floorboards where the red pasta sauce had been wiped away. He looked exhausted, the adrenaline of the confrontation fading to leave only the gray, flat landscape of his disappointment. "They're gone," he said quietly. "They're gone," I repeated. I folded my knitting and set it in the basket. "Go to sleep, Mitchell. Tomorrow is Friday. We have a lot of work to do." "What did he mean by that?" Mitchell asked, looking up, his eyes shadowed under the brass reading lamp. "What he said on the porch. I know how to write a loss report. He's an adjuster, Mom. He spent 25 years finding the loopholes in property deeds and insurance policies. If he files a fraudulent claim, or if he files a lien for improvements he says he made to this house, he can lock up the title so you can't sell it or transfer it to me. He can make it so you can't even get a home equity loan." "He can try," I said, "but he's not the only one who knows the layout of this house." I went to bed, but I didn't sleep. I lay on my back, listening to the snow rattle against the glass of the master bedroom, thinking about the empty cot in the hallway, the empty guest room, and the $50,000 my sister was holding in a bank in Toledo. First thing Friday morning, the locksmith's truck pulled into the driveway. The snow had stopped, leaving a heavy, white blanket 6 inches deep over the yard and the roofs of the neighborhood. The sky was a pale, blinding blue, the winter sun reflecting off the snow with a sharp, cold glare. Wayne, the locksmith, was an older man with grease-stained fingers and a heavy ring of blank keys hanging from his belt. He worked quickly, the sharp, brassy clink-clink of his tools echoing down the hallway as he drilled out the old cylinders on the front and back doors. Mitchell stood on the porch, watching him, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "There you go, Mrs. Vance," Wayne said, handing me 3 bright silver keys. "Brand new commercial-grade deadbolts. Nobody's getting in here without these." "Thank you, Wayne," I said. He began to pack his heavy metal toolbox, but as he reached for the latch of his case, he stopped, looking toward the side of the house where the driveway met the foundation. "Did you know your basement hopper window is unlatched?" he asked, pointing toward the window well near the guest room. "The snow's drifted over it, but the glass is standing about 2 inches open." I felt a cold prickle of alarm at the base of my neck. "The basement window?" "Yeah, the latch on those old metal hoppers is easy to strip if you know what you're doing," Wayne said, walking over to the well. He knelt in the snow, his boots crunching on the crust. "Looks like someone unscrewed the lock mechanism from the inside. They didn't break the glass, they just took the bracket off the frame. You can push it right open from the outside." A thief who leaves by the front door always leaves a back window unlatched. They never truly accept that they no longer have a right to the key. "Can you fix it?" I asked. "I can put a heavy-duty sliding bolt on it," Wayne said, standing up and brushing the snow from his knees. "But I'll have to go down to the basement to drill into the concrete frame." "I'll show you the way," I said. I led Wayne down the wooden stairs into the damp, cold basement. The single light bulb flickered, casting long, jumping shadows across the concrete floor and my mother's old Singer machine. While Wayne set up his drill by the hopper window, my eyes drifted to the corner where my green canvas gardening apron hung from a nail on the wall. My heart began to beat in a quick, frantic rhythm. I walked over to the apron, my fingers searching the deep pocket where I had hidden the key to my mother's metal sewing box. The box where I had locked the Tyvek envelope, containing the Toledo divorce files, the Lake Drive lease, and Valerie's letter to Calvin. The pocket was empty. I reached deeper, my fingers clawing at the canvas, but there was nothing there but a few dried sunflower seeds and a paper packet of tomato seeds from last spring. I turned slowly. The metal sewing box sat on the shelf beneath the sewing machine. The lid was closed, but when I touched the latch, it popped open with a light, hollow click. The lock had been forced. I pulled the white Tyvek envelope from the box. It was unsealed, the plastic torn at the seam. I slid my hand inside, my fingers searching the pages. But the space was mostly empty. The photographs of the motels in Battle Creek and Lansing were still there, the proof of Calvin's infidelity. But the original lease agreement for the Lake Drive apartment and the UPS Box 402 receipt, the pieces of evidence that proved they had planned this for 2 years and had signed the lease before Valerie ever moved in, were gone. Valerie had taken them. She had come down here while Mitchell and I were in the kitchen on Thanksgiving Eve, or perhaps during the chaos of her packing last night. She had found the key, opened the box, and stripped the envelope of the only documents that could prove their systematic conspiracy of marital waste. My hand shook as I held the empty plastic sleeve. Without that lease, Denise Fletcher's strategy of proving pre-planned cohabitation was crippled. "All right, Mrs. Vance," Wayne's voice boomed from the back of the cellar, the sudden sound making me jump. "That bolt is secure. Nobody's pushing this window open now." Before I could answer, a loud metallic clink echoed from the window well behind him. Wayne stopped, his drill in his hand, his eyes widening as he looked at the freshly bolted hopper window. Through the dusty glass, a dark shadow had just blocked the white light of the snow. Someone was trying to push the window open from the outside. The window well groaned as Mitchell's heavy boots slammed into the snow outside. "Wayne, stay here," I said, my voice sharp enough to make the locksmith freeze. I followed Mitchell up the basement stairs and out the back door. The cold air hit my face like a slap, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine and frozen earth. Around the side of the house, Mitchell was already standing over the window well, his hand gripping the collar of a dark woolen coat. The man in the well was not a stranger. It was Calvin. He was kneeling in the deep drift, his hands red and raw, his fingernails bleeding where he had tried to claw the frozen wood of the window frame away from the concrete. He was shivering violently, his light trench coat soaked through with melted snow. He looked up at Mitchell, then at me, his eyes wide, hollow, and wild with a pathetic animal terror. I just needed the files," Calvin whimpered, his teeth chattering so hard the words were barely recognizable. "The Toledo files, the lease. Cheryl, please. She's gone." Mitchell let go of his collar, stepping back with a look of pure disgust. "Where is she, Dad?" "She took the silver car," Calvin whispered, a ragged sob escaping his throat as he collapsed against the brick foundation. "She took her bags. She took the $48,000. We went to a diner in Walker to talk about what Mitchell said, and she told me I was a liability. She said my name was on the lease, not hers. She said she was going back to Ohio, and if I ever contacted her, she'd show the Insurance Compliance Board the emails I sent her from the company's server." He looked at his hands, which were covered in gray basement dirt and blood. "She left me, Cheryl," he cried, his voice breaking into a high, thin wail that was swallowed by the cold wind. "She used me to get her settlement. She used me to buy her car. And then she left me in the parking lot of a big boy diner with $80 in my pocket." I stood on the snow-covered lawn, looking down at the man I had slept beside for 28 years. He had spent his life adjusting claims, measuring the exact cost of other people's disasters, completely blind to the fact that he was building his own ruin out of paper and lies. He had thought Valerie was his prize, his escape from the quiet, heavy routine of our marriage. But Valerie had only ever been a mirror, reflecting his own weakness back at him until he was empty enough to be discarded. "The files are gone, Calvin," I said, my voice quiet and calm in the winter air. "Valerie took them last night. She thought she was destroying my evidence." Calvin looked up, his face twisted in confusion. Then you don't have the proof? You can't show the lawyer?" "She took her copies," I said, reaching into my pocket to touch the cold brass keys Wayne had just given me. "But she didn't take the certified copies. The private investigator Gary hired had already filed them with the family court in Toledo, and my lawyer, Denise, filed them with the credit union and your regional manager at 9 o'clock this morning." Calvin's eyes went perfectly still. The realization hit him slowly, like the cold seep of the snow through his wool coat. "My job," he whispered. "You spent 25 years managing loss, Calvin," I said. "You should have known that eventually the bill comes due." I turned my back on him. "Mitchell, go inside. Wayne is waiting to finish the locks." We left him there, kneeling in the frozen dirt of my father's yard, a man who had traded his home, his son, and his life for a woman who didn't even remember his name when she drove away. By mid-December, the snow had settled deep over Grand Rapids, capping the brick ranch house in a thick, silent white. Mitchell had gone back to Denver. His graduate school tuition was fully secured, the court having frozen Calvin's pension and our joint accounts under an emergency order for marital waste. He had called me from the airport, his voice lighter than it had been in years, promising to come back for Christmas. The house was mine now. The legal documents had been signed, Calvin having waived any claim to the property in exchange for me not pursuing criminal charges for the unauthorized bank withdrawal. He was living in a small rented room above a laundromat in Kentwood, his job at the insurance firm gone, his name a black mark on the regional registry. Valerie had vanished back into the flat, gray landscape of Ohio, her silver car and her Toledo savings her only companions in the cold. I sat at the kitchen island, holding a warm mug of chamomile tea. The kitchen was clean, the yellow walls bright under the morning sun. The sewing machine in the basement was uncovered, a half-finished quilt of blue and white calico resting on the needle, waiting for the winter to pass. I looked out the window at the empty driveway. There were no tire tracks in the snow, no voices in the hallway, no quiet, hushed whispers behind the guest room door. I had spent 3 decades holding the walls of this family together, smoothing over the cracks, carrying the invisible weight of their selfishness in silence. I had thought that if I stopped, the ceiling would fall and crush us all. But as I took a slow sip of my tea, listening to the quiet, rhythmic ticking of my father's clock on the wall, I realized the truth. The scaffolding doesn't need the house to stand. It only needs to realize it was never the one living inside it. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 28 years, I let myself rest.